next speaker is Yuval Kremnitzer. Yuval teaches at Bezalel Academy of Art and some other institutions. He's a philosopher focusing in his work on the intersection of authority and technology, and his forthcoming book for the M.A.D. press is titled The Emperor's New Nudity, The Return of Authoritarianism and the Digital Obscene, and it deals with a deep historical and philosophical background of contemporary new authoritarianism and the medium in which it has taken root, the internet. The title of his today's talk is War is Senseless, or How to End a War. Yuval, please, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'd like to sincerely thank the organizers for putting together this conference and all the participants, speakers, and audience alike. It is common courtesy to open with such an acknowledgement, but I truly believe it to be especially merited considering the topic at hand and how hard it is to think, to talk, and even listen to talk about war. Which brings me to the title I've chosen for today's talk, War is Senseless. Is there a bigger, emptier cliché than this? Is there anything more banal, less fruitful to be said in this regard? Is it not obvious what needs to be done about war, namely, to be done with it? What point is there to a philosophical discussion of war, to the meanderings of a conceptual inquiry, given that what we are called to do is so plain to see? Right off the bat, we find ourselves faced with the unbearable discrepancy between the solemn gravity of the subject, which calls for immediate action, and the ready-made formulae that language supplies us with as we venture to address it. There is an excruciating gap between the strong emotions war provokes, the sense of our being confronted by a fateful occurrence, of being subject to actual existential threats, and the unbearable vacuousness of speech. War is dramatic, talk of it is puny and superfluous. Present company excluded, of course. In a sense, all I set out to do in the time allotted to me is to dwell on what is arguably the emptiest, most washed-out pronouncement made on the subject of war, namely that war, I hope you're all sitting down, is a negative thing. I do aim nonetheless to try and pour some substance into this truism. My starting point is simple enough. The difficulty of discussing war is not merely an emotional, but a conceptual one. War is a negative thing, so I will argue not only in as much as it engenders negative emotions in us, but in a straightforward ontological sense. My title proposes to encapsulate this simple claim in the formula, war is senseless. I should like firstly to establish this claim, and then secondly, to explain why it is not an empty one, mainly by suggesting some significant lessons it may serve to teach us regarding the object of these reflections, war. So the course of my discussion will thus gradually bear out the connection between three senses implicit in my title, three threads of the conceptual blunder that inheres in the concept of war. Number one, our sense of perplexity in the face of war, the proverbial fog of war, our sense of lacking a clear notion of the going-ons that comprise it, hence that war is essentially an opaque, muddled and muddling sort of affair. Two, the problem of defining or conceptualizing war. And three, the difficulty of describing war in terms of achievement, of the pursuit and realization of human ends. War is thus characterized by its being without a concept, by our want of a concept of it, as by the apparent lack of something that can be said to constitute the definitive achievement of war. The claim that war is senseless in no way purports to be a contribution to the mystique or mystification of war, so as to allow us to withdraw from the challenge it poses to thinking. It is quite to the contrary. The aim is to wrest a characterization of war from and by means of the obstacles it lays in the way of reason, which is to say, by way of negation. The core of the discussion proceeds accordingly in general terms, and yet it aims through and through to furnish us with the tools that will allow us to face up to the current moment, the very war that constitutes our present. As I hope to sketch toward the end of my talk, war today, I believe, is best understood as a sort of self-conscious negativity or contradiction, internalizing or redoubling its own negativity, which I know is very abstract right now, but will hopefully make more sense by the end of my lecture. In the next few minutes, I will be spelling out the general claim that war is senseless through a sequence of claims, each of which serving to highlight a different negative facet of war's relation to the fundaments of our conceptual thought. Approaching them in ascending order, we will begin by inquiring about war as an object of experience, then move on to the relation of war to essence and purpose, With this, we will briefly take up the question of war's relation to human nature or history, which will bring us to the relevance today of the Kant-Hegel debate on war. So, not much. Before that, however, I would like to point out in broad strokes why, to begin with, I take this via negativa as the way to go about the question of war. War, as we may put it here, bears a fundamental affinity to the negative element of thought itself. It may be that war's imperviousness to direct contemplation is precisely to do with our being quite unable to think besides it. At the dawn of philosophy, it was Heraclitus that had urged us to realize that war is common and justice is strife, and that all things come into being and pass away through strife. Saying that war resists conceptualization is not to say that war is a stranger to thought. Quite the opposite. Our thinking, even in times of peace, is suffused with war. Thinking is, as we may put it, at constant war to contain war. The double signification of what containment entails in this context is crucial to mind. If war is to be kept from overflowing in every direction and engulf everything under its tidal wave, including those seeking to confront it as thinkers, if it is to be contained, confined, our thinking is required to internalize war, to assimilate and make it part of itself. Hegel exemplifies this. A fight to the death, a putative momentary episode in the sweeping narrative of the phenomenology of spirit, somehow functions at once as a kind of monad or symbol of the entire progression, and so as an image of dialectic itself, thought's manner of transitioning from one concept to the next by way of unraveling the contradiction inherent in each. In Hegel, let us briefly recall, we only attain self-consciousness against the backdrop of a fight to the death. Only when that fight terminates in a consequence that could in no way be foreseen at its outset, only once the fate of mutual annihilation is superseded, does the advent of self-consciousness, consciousness mediated through that of another, take place. Once the battle is decided by the relenting of one side and the triumphing of the other, life is reckoned to prevail on both sides, and the great epic of freedom commences. In itself, war is of no significance. It is a moment of thought's eclipsing and losing itself. War is a vanishing mediator if there ever was one. It mediates by vanishing. Mediation is nothing but its vanishing. What we have here, in fact, is a story of two negations. In order for that negation to emerge, which propels thinking forward, call it history if you will, the absolute form of negation which negates itself as well, the splitting of the middle term into the extremes, as Hegel puts it, must first give way. With Hegel in mind, I want to argue the following fundamental point. War precedes thought and conditions it. It lies at the background of thinking. It is precisely as a condition, a threshold of both our experience and cognition, that war cannot appear as an object of either. But this does not entail our utter preclusion from making sense of it. Indeed, it is as a liminal phenomenon of such unique character that it affords some delimitation. War is not simply ridden with contradictions. It presents itself in thinking as an image of something elemental, a condition of thinking of which we cannot conceive as such, a contradiction, something that testifies against itself. Our incapacity to conceive of contradiction is a real one, so we are frequently told by logicians. Or rather, there is nothing for us to conceive of in the idea of something both being and not being so and so. And yet, in the midst of war, we are, at one and the same time, living and not living. War puts us on the verge of death. Only in hindsight will we find out who and what remains. The point is this. In war, we experience something unthinkable. So how is such a real contradiction to be thought? The next few minutes proceed in a sequence of claims aimed at tracing this intractability of war on several different registers of thought and experience, namely intuition, essence, and purpose. So let us start with intuition, with the characterization of war as an object of experience in Kant's sense of the term, i.e. as a spatio-temporal phenomenon. At this minimal level, the zero ground of experience, we may as well take our cue from everyday language. War breaks out, is an outbreaking. War breaks out, that is, while it may have an onslaught, it has no definite onset. War is entered into without knowing how one will emerge from it. Plans are made, alternative schemes are prospected for all sorts of foreseeable scenarios, and yet an inalienable current of sheer contingency persists throughout. War breaks out in an instant, so we say, and yet that very instant proves to be but one link in an ongoing causal chain. In war, contingent circumstances immediately appear predestined, the materialization of necessity. We say that war broke out in a particular moment, thereby implying that it has in effect been lurking at the background all along, ready to erupt at any moment. As soon as it does, already it appears to have been there from time immemorial. Behind our time, there operates a different mythic time, a time of fate and of the eternal recurrence of the same. War, in other words, emerges as the return of the repressed, a reappearing of something that never quite had an antecedent. Just as war breaks out rather than begins, so it may be said to break off or ebb or conclude, but so always for the time being, only until the next outbreak. War, in short, has neither a beginning nor end. Nor does it have, as we will see more closely later, a terminus or a telos. In the darkest sense, war is our end. We are such creatures as are capable of bringing their end upon themselves. In war, at the moment of outbreak, we glimpse not only a primordial past, or an absolute past which was never a present, but also a premonition of a primordial future, a preordained finis that life is toiling to postpone for as long as possible, the end of all ends. As it comes to space, things appear at first sight considerably clearer. A war takes place in a given circumscribable area. Though it is typically instigated by the trespassing or transgressing of borders, it no less typically results in the setting of new ones. War discriminates between front and rear. It involves maps and surveys, countless dissections and demarcations of the terrain. It is the site wherein the practical effort of establishing a border by violent means takes place. In truth, however, war is an occasion of disorientation, not only but also in thought. War is ab initio a crisis of containment. It always threatens to spread out to further fronts. The seemingly rigid differentiations between front and rear, even between friend and foe, prove to be porous and soluble through the course of war. As such an object that breaks its way into experience, war oscillates between the most generic and the utterly idiosyncratic, between a generality that repels all manners of singularization and a singularity that precludes all manners of generalization. War, as we will return to say more about shortly, is one of the constants of human history, and it harbors a flattening force, a devastating indifference to the differences that sustain our everyday existence. But then what is the experience of war, and who is it that experiences it? War is a traumatic event, an undigestible, untransmissible reality. The closer we get to it, the less appropriate it becomes to speak of experience in the ordinary acceptation of the term. Those at the front are exposed to unutterable atrocities, experiences of which there is no simple possibility of integrating into the biographical chronic, and which are immensely difficult to express in words. The all-in-all unusual bearing of war, exceedingly generic and encompassing, while at the same time singular, personalized, and circumstantial to the point of idiosyncrasy, leads us to the following claim. War possesses a special, excessive form of identity, and yet has no essence, is void of ipsity. There is a long-standing tradition of thought that identifies the power of the concept with the capacity to comprehend and determine the essence of the object. With war, though, we are dealing with an anti-essence. Here again, the point is not that war bears no relation to essence, but that that relation, in war's case, is essentially negative. Thus, in Hegel, for instance, war forms a kind of trial by fire to all that presents itself as quintessential. It is in war, so goes the argument, that we attest each time anew to what is essential to us, what is worth fighting for and worthy of even our utmost sacrifice, our very lives. While lacking an essence of its own, the necessity that war embodies is tethered to the affinities we bear to various essences which we depend on, revealing their instability and vulnerability. War, like Heraclitus' fire, is not the ultimate principle, but an anti-principle, what puts all principles to the test of endurance, what pushes them towards either perishing, adapting, or crystallizing. As such, as an anti-essence, it speaks to the indefinitely recurring need to validate our form of life and reevaluate our lives. Skipping a quote here from Hegel. Which brings us to the next register. For posing the question of what is essential to us is at once a way of asking about what is worthy of constituting a purpose for us, the object of our pursuit. And yet war is, perhaps above all other things, without a purpose. We might put it like this: nobody wants war. This sounds incredibly naive. Surely you would say that no one fights unless out of sheer necessity is a little more than common lip service. And we all know that an entire security industrial complex is based on the revenues of war. To say nothing of the wide cast of rulers whose political survival depends on the perpetuation of war, and so on and so worse. Nonetheless, this claim should be taken with all seriousness at its face value. Nobody wants war. War appears as an alien will, sometimes as from a higher order, and in any case from without. War is an allotment of fate, a divine decree, or a historical inevitability. As they concern us here, these are equivalent expressions, also to the extent that what they indicate is not merely a necessity vis-à-vis something laid upon or before us as unnegotiable, but also a will that we must either cede or accede to, or else do our utmost to resist. This will be a decisive question. Why and under what conditions, even though war is reckoned with per force and not as the objectification of our will, are we called to affirm, and why is it that we agree to rally behind its cause, i.e. identify our will and consent with what forces itself upon us? And so how, despite all that, is resistance possible? What could constitute an effective countermeasure to war? It is crucial to understand that protesting discontent, avowing our disagreement with war, is not enough. As was stated, nobody wants war. But war, you might soberly say, is not a decree from above. War is waged on us by the enemy. This is true, but there's the rub. For it is there in between the big other's will, fate or God or history, and the small other, the enemy, that war gets decided on. Indeed, their confusion or confabulation, the big and the small other, is an inextricable facet of war. Let us ask, what lies behind the failure of intelligence to predict the outbreak of war? The attempt of interpreting the enemy's intents, that small other with whom we are locked in a mirroring relationship of sorts, an either or of me or him, is at bottom an attempt to divine the moment when he, who certainly does not want war any more than I do, is arriving at the conclusion that now is the time, that the moment has come when an alien will of a superior order of necessitation is now decisive, calling the shots. This is the notoriously precarious spot at the heart of the words that war consists of: intelligence assessment, deterrence. The enemy is deterred by war, not by us. He is deterred, that is, until he isn't. Deterrence works because neither side wills war, and it fails because there sooner or later comes a point when another will is calling the shots. That is effectively how war is avoided or joined in, based on some such impregnable calculation, the attempt to divine the moment, the exact point in time when an enemy turns from a threat into an instrument of war. There is a further salient aspect to the claim that war is without purpose. It does not suffice to say, as we might with von Clausewitz, that war is a continuation of policy with other means, or say with Foucault that politics is a continuation of war by other means. War is not simply a means to some further end. War is principally a means to an end that opposes it. It is a reluctant means in the service of one or another type of order. War, in other words, is always waged for the sake of peace. Not necessarily a just peace, for the most part an unjust one, of the sort to be maintained by force by the stronger side. What is important to understand is that it is for this precise reason, wars being a kind of means that is antinomic to its end, that it is capable of becoming an end unto itself, a black hole of sacrifice. We mentioned earlier that the notion that in war we discover or are called to ascertain what is most essential for us, what is worthy of our sacrifice. The less clear we are about the answer to this question, the more unsettled our sphere of purposes already is in its own right, the more inclined this equation is to invert itself. We prove to ourselves that we have a purpose, that there are things which are quintessential to us, even if you couldn't quite yet call them by name, by means of sacrifice. The very act of sacrifice becomes both the testimony and evidence that something exists for the sake of which it is made, and all the more so the less capable we are of gathering behind actual purposes. With this swerving between means and ends, the way that means come to supplant and usurp the place of ends, we've also come to touch on the reason why, despite it being an agent of destruction, we also know that war is perhaps the central manufactory of our means and instruments. War is the paradigmatic nursing ground for technology, namely the order of means whose presumed function is to enable us to realize our ends. Our instruments develop and proliferate far more significantly than anywhere else in the context of campaigns for mutual annihilation and subdual, and not, as we are wont of telling ourselves, in the context of a struggle for domination over nature. The pleasure and benefit we draw from these apparatuses in times of peace are not seldom the collateral effects of the war machine that brought to their development. This is a very material manifestation of what Hegel dubbed the cunning of history. Of all places, it is where human purposes are fated to doom that a different kind of persiveness, parasitic on human ends, is in a ceaselessly accelerating process of advent and evolution. Progress, it used to be called. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks, we read in Isaiah. In a sense, this is not so much a prefiguration of a utopic horizon as it is a quasi-empirical description of technological advance. That is, provided we remember that it hardly stops at swords and plows, but streams on to reach nuclear weapons, which might provide in turn for sustainable energy, and so on and so forth. And that the putative primacy of iron swords raises a formidable question as to the possible terminal point. And so this question concerning technology naturally brings us to say a few words, having briefly considered the concepts of experience, essence, and purpose, on the relation of the human animal, not merely the bearer of nature, but the maker of culture and history, to war. It is certainly fair to say that waging war is what human beings do. But is this a definition of humans or war? Here as well, where war emerges as a kind of aporia. At the threshold, okay, this is time for me to take a sip of water, otherwise no words will come out of my mouth. Okay, how are we on time?
Well,
great. That's what I wanted to hear.
I
so,
you're over half.
yes. We're good.
No, it's not.
Okay.
Like 10 or
Okay.
10 more minutes.
We'll get there. So, war emerges as a kind of aporia at the threshold between nature and history. Is war a vestige of nature that inheres in culture, or rather conversely, a symbol of culture in the midst of nature's kingdom? Modern political philosophy is based, as is well known, on the identification of the natural condition of mankind with the state of war of all against all. On this conception, war pertains to nature in man, which is to be distinguished from nature simplicitaire, and to some anthropic arche, which poses an ineliminable peril to the rule of culture from within, a repository of explosive violence that sovereign order is called for to hold in check. If, from the point of view of political philosophy, war is a manifestation of nature within the sphere of historical life, from a zoological perspective, so to speak, war stands out as an emblem of culture within nature. War is a sophisticated, organized form of violence, and a potential metric for measuring a natural species' level of sophistication would be the level of social complexity involved in war, the ability to form alliances and leagues, deploy subterfuges, contraptions, etc. War, it seems, belongs to both nature and culture, and neither, attesting to the impossibility of their straightforward co-articulation. In war, nature and culture are neither separate nor unified, suggesting conflict is what constitutes the relation. Now, I think the Kant-Hegel debate, which I will now very briefly comment upon, can be productively approached as not only responding to this general characteristic of war as a negativity, a real contradiction, but also addressing the burning question of the modernity of war, the relation of war to modernization and vice versa. From this perspective, the debate can be seen as revolving around the relative roles of modern institutions in the propagation and taming of war. So let us begin with Kant. In his salient essay on the perpetual peace, Kant is explicitly drawing on the aporia we are considering. Kant perceives in war an expression, perhaps the quintessential expression of nature's cunning, a secularized concept of providence. As a phenomenon of man's natural history, we may find in war indicia of the process by which man's egocentric pathological inclination lead in a gradual fashion to rational collaboration. The very senselessness of war, its failure even to serve the selfish purposes it's intended to serve, is so unreasonable, such a scandalous offense against reason, that it just might serve as a call for reason. Reason is summoned, as it were, to take arms against this most unreasonable of phenomena, war. War, in its utter negativity, is a self-positing call for its own end, a minimal, quasi-natural imperative to find a more reasonable way of handling things. The title of the essay, famously borrowed from a satirical caption to the caricature of a graveyard, is revealing. Just like death, in its very abject horror, seems to impose a quasi-instinctual call for its cultural symbolic handling in funeral rites, as Hegel teaches us elsewhere, so war as a scandal to reason calls forth reason to put it to rest. Just as a dead body doesn't appear to us as a simple fact of nature, which we ought to come to terms with and accept, but rather as something horrid, unnatural, and upsetting, demanding action from us, so too does war lay before us a primordial choice. Either bring it to rest or allow it to haunt us all the way to our graves. If death pushes us towards social practice, war, the ever more efficient mass distribution of death, in its very atavism, pushes towards cultivation and modernization. The cunning of nature, its manner of lending itself to abutting reason's quest for liberation from it, is borne out by war. For instance, in the way in which war leads, as was earlier noted, to technological advance. Kant's example is the domestication of horses for military purposes. From a participant's point of view, war means the removal of constraints, whereas from the vantage of the species development, war is a mechanism of domestication. I'll skip something. So when Kant points us toward, this is well known, this cosmopolitan world order, which takes its inspiration from, to a large extent, from civil society. You know, a law in the absence of law. This is not, right, in distinction from a global state. And what is law in the absence of law? What possibilities of intercourse exist between peoples and states that do not share in a common system of law? The answer is commerce and war. And Kant sees in the history of international relations a parallel model to that of civil society, society of strangers, in which the constitutive self-interestedness of individual members, even the vehement competition it implies between them, eventually gives rise or can give rise to a collective order of commercial collaboration. Now, Hegel's intricate way of inheriting Kant's notion of nature's cunning in his notion of cunning of history shows forth inter alia in a reconception of the relation to war. Relying on the funeral analogy, we could say that Hegel draws an implicit distinction between the absolute need to bring wars to an end and the idea of being done with war once and for all. Just as the need to bury the dead is not identical to doing away with death, but is rather a way for the community to come together in mourning over the loss of individuals, a way in which the finitude of individual life is an essential ingredient of the continuity of social life, so too for Hegel, war is an integral part of historical life. This general difference in orientation between Kant and Hegel is grounded, I'd like to suggest, in their different assessment of the role of modern institutions in the economy of war. Indeed, an overzealous attempt to rid the social body of what might surpass individual life is for Hegel what leads to war. Our ways of living, as we have started saying earlier, have an inner tendency to stagnate and ossify in time. But it is crucial to note what it is that Hegel takes to be leading towards such stagnation. A quote from the Philosophy of Right: "In peace, the bounds of civil life are extended, all its spheres become fairly established, and in the long run, people become stuck in their ways. Their particular characteristics become increasingly rigid and ossified, but the unity of the body is essential to health," etc., etc. We all know this very well, this famous quote. As we heard from several speakers, Avineri's famed interpretation of these passages sees in war something like a necessary jolt, like a disease to activate and restore health to the body. But we ought to note what exactly throws the state out of balance here and what state he is dealing with. For Hegel, the modern state emerges as a mediator between the oldest institution, the family, and the strange, uncanny, I would even say, modern institution of civil society. It mediates, so to speak, between a primal attachment, which precedes and conditions individual subjectivity, grounded in feeling, and the strange forward-facing quasi-institutionalization of self-interested individuality that is civil society. If in Kant, civil society within a state is a model for international relations, Hegel seems more aware that the trajectory is in fact reversed, that in modern societies a logic of relation between groups has infiltrated the group, so to speak. It is this element that seems to spill over and prevent the state from harmonization. War breaks out, mind you, not when the logic of the family is expanded, as we might suspect, under the concept of tribalism, but just when the logic of civil society, the society of strangers based on private interest rather than a common good, overexpands and dominates, which we might note is the tendency of capitalist societies. It is then that the state is called on to provide for the dimension of a whole that has primacy over its parts, but in a kind of a negative of the family, sacrificing what the family produces, namely offspring. And so, differently put, I'll summarize this phrase, the state manifests itself in war, and so perhaps to an increasingly greater degree, the less it has substance and validity other than this, which we might stipulate further, the less it finds other institutional means of mediating between the family and civil society. A chronic problem for capitalist society. Now, what does all this have to teach us about the wars we are facing today? This is coming to the end. I've been arguing so far that war is a negative thing, not merely in the trivial sense of being a morbid and brutal business, but in a fundamental ontological sense. There is, I think, a peculiar apocalyptic streak to the current war, and not just in the terrifying immediate sense of the prospect of a war that will effectively end all wars, and with them the entire race. By an apocalyptic element, what I have in mind is rather the following. War, so much as I've tried to characterize it by way of negation, becomes through history sort of, in a way, conscious of itself, meaning that its negative, contradictory nature gradually emerges onto the surface. The contradictions inherent in war are being subsumed by the war discourse and duplicated in it. To indicate, if only skimply, what I mean by this claim, I want to very briefly make a record of 3 novelties of 20th century war. 1, during the 20th century, we first became acquainted with the phenomena of a world war, a war that involves all the world's major political powers and whose aftermaths are earth-shaking and epoch-making in the full meaning of these phrases. These were wars that brought down empires and states and gave rise to new ones, and introduced unprecedented global agendas in their wake, changing the map of the world. 2, the epoch that followed the 2 world wars commenced with the immediate inauguration of the Cold War, yet another utterly novel configuration of global conflict, whose alleged pretext was to prevent the conflict between the 2 major world blocs to deteriorate into a hot war that will have effectively meant planetary catastrophe. The Cold War was, in this sense, a strange incorporation of the Kantian stance on war as what ought not to be into the very logic of war. In parallel with all this, we've also become acquainted with yet another species of boundless war, a temporal boundlessness this time, the perpetual war. This is the type of war that numerous countries and transnational organizations have declared on various non-state actors. Terrorism and drugs are the most famous cases. These wars are literally endless. They are fought or conducted without constitutive terms to define their conclusion, guidelines, victory, and defeat. Moreover, these wars, as indicated by the amassing literature on the subject, are analogous in many respects to the chronic war waged by the immune system against various foreign invaders, and which, of course, challenges the rationale for war provided by Hegel according to Avineri and those who follow him. Right? Such war cannot be thought of on analogy with an ultimately strengthening attack on the immune system, a jolt to the system. The chronic is not a passing crisis, but a deteriorating and dangerous condition which colors the lives of those plagued by it, with little hope for cure of its passing short of a dramatic breakthrough in science or a miracle. So mind you, common to 3 novelties in war introduced in the 20th century is the unearthing of its own antinomic nature, its autogenous antagonism to limits and boundaries in space, scope, and time. In this dreadful moment, fairly deep into the 21st century, we might be facing an exceptionally malignant combination of these novelties of modern war. The current global struggle for hegemony is a seething crucible of adversities whose potential overheating effectively means mass annihilation. It is a battle fought in constant equivocation between the perpetual war on terrorism and the global or world war, in an ever more rapid approach towards the ultimate terminus, the absolute final war. We are dreaded by the prospect of a third world war, which many of us declare to already be taking place. And I take this very ambiguity, whether we are in the midst of or on the brink of world war, to be the crucial point. It is a war on the precipice, a war that escalates piecemeal, all but imperceivably, as if in search of a boiling point, a point where water finally evaporates. Our war-ridden epoch is in that sense an epoch of overt self-conscious contradiction. We are fighting, both explicitly and directly, for the cause of preventing or containing a graver war, the very one we seem to be getting closer to with each day of fighting. If war in general, as I argued, is a limit condition, the war taking shape in front of our eyes is a war on limits, continuously and self-consciously raising the question, what, if any, are the limits of war? Let me try and make this point a little more concrete, and with this I finish. We hear much talk today of proxy wars. This can become useful if we take it that the proxy is not only a war fought by proxies, keeping bigger powers from directly engaging in warfare and playing a supportive role, but if we also understand in proxy war something like a quasi-war or war by approximation, a very real war that is at the same time merely an approximation of a bigger war. These are wars that are already taking place, wreaking havoc, but they are conceived as a way to avoid a bigger, even more consequential confrontation. A proxy war then would need to be understood as both relying on and eroding the distinction between an actual war and a potential one. Alluding to the infamous name given to the above-mentioned incorporation of Kant's outlook on war into the rationale of the Cold War, M.A.D, the acronym for mutually assured destruction, we can speak today of a maddening war, in the dual sense that it drives those of us trying to make sense of it crazy, but also that it does so precisely by making mutually assured destruction, the condition to be avoided at all costs, into a verb, into something we keep approximating in the name of avoiding it. In this constellation, it is not only the geographical distinction between local, regional, and global conflict, the geographical limits of war that are endangered. For we are dealing with wars that threaten to spill over and seem more and more difficult to contain spatially, but even more fundamentally, we witness a war on the precipice, on the edge, a war that is continuously pushing towards a wider, even less containable conflict. Spilling over doesn't only mean involving more parties in direct conflict, but also expanding the levels of violence and destruction, pushing ever more closely towards complete mass destruction. So we have the spatial limits and the scope of war being expanded, pushed to the brink, and we have wars with no end in sight, pushing against the normal passage into some kind of new political arrangement. If war is, as I argued, relying on Hegel at the beginning of my talk, a vanishing mediator, we are dealing today with a mediation that will not vanish. And what amounts to the same thing, the role of mediation has become one of continuous vanishing, a show of impotence. A war that won't end in some kind of accord is a war that continuously disempowers mediation, both in the narrow sense of diplomacy and more broadly the sphere of conversation and negotiations. Further, in war today, an irrational willingness to sacrifice life is becoming integrated into the logic of deterrence, supposedly grounded in the safeguarding of life. We witness a strange blending of the two rivaling sides in Hegel's mythical struggle to the death, clinging to prestige, showing oneself willing to sacrifice life for some higher freedom, is presented as an essential ingredient of deterrence. The other side must know that we are, to some extent, crazy and unpredictable, untethered to our interests of survival and prosperity. That is the only way for us to win, namely to survive and one day perhaps to prosper. And so clinging to honor and clinging to life become interlocked. And when I say the negativity of war is being integrated into the very practice and discourse of contemporary war, so as not to say logic, I can think of no more horrifying an example than my own country. In a new book, Bob Woodward quotes President Biden scolding Prime Minister Netanyahu, yelling at him, "You have no strategy." I cannot avoid the terrifying thought that in this age of the self-conscious or maddening war, having no strategy functions effectively as a sort of strategy. Certainly, Netanyahu's infamous avoidance of any settlement, his final non-solution, so to speak, has turned Bartleby's famous "I prefer not to" into a new kind of state power. By avoiding an end to the war, Netanyahu is getting closer and closer to shaping the war he wants, a civilizational struggle against the enemies of the West and a sidestepping of the very local and traumatic conflict between Palestinians in Israel. In postponing an end to the war, Netanyahu has also found a new and surprising way to remain in power, which goes well beyond the Hobbesian paradigm and even its much more archaic roots, which we can find in Aeschylus's Eumenides. We have a deep-rooted conception according to which civilian unity under the rule of law is the prerequisite for war against foreign enemies. Famously for Hobbes, failing to provide security against foreign enemies is the one clear case of the violation of the pact between the populace and the sovereign, rendering the legitimacy of sovereignty null and void. In today's maddening reality, prolonging war indefinitely has become a strategy to avoid the consequences of such dramatic absolute failures of the sovereign pact, and war is waged indefinitely not in order to keep the populace united under a shared goal, but impotent, torn between the necessity to fight foreign threats and the sense of utter powerlessness to remove a failed government. In today's constellation where civil society is often in direct clash with state power, revisiting Hegel's insight about the complicated triangulation in modernity of family, civil society, and state becomes an urgent task. And if contemporary war is indeed a war on limits, perhaps ending a war entails the ability to draw a line, to find a way to establish a limit from within, so as to free ourselves at least from the torturing question, where is the limit? The limit is not out there to be discovered, but right here, namely, wherever we manage to draw it. Okay, thank you. Sorry, this was quite long.
Thank you. Yes, this was. Thank you for remaining in almost acceptable levels of overtime. But yes, okay. Of course, there's a lot of a lot of opportunities. So I'm sure there's a lot of questions. So, who wants to start? Any questions already? Okay. Then Daniel, please. Wait for the mic, please.
Is it working? Yeah.
No, sorry. We have Daniel and then Zdravko and then Ogden.
Yes, thank you very much for the very insightful and complex talk. I've just got a very small question concerning a detail at the end of the talk. So you spoke about Biden saying that Netanyahu doesn't have a strategy, which I think may be true. Anyway, at the beginning of the war, Netanyahu stated that there are actually two goals to achieve in the war: the destruction of Hamas and the liberation of all hostages. I think that at least the first goal cannot be achieved in the strict sense, militarily, but not in a complete sense. So do you think that Netanyahu already took into consideration this fact that he actually cannot destroy Hamas in a complete sense, which would mean that he already had the strategy to not have a strategy in the sense that that would be a perpetual war in the end. Yeah. And I'm not sure about that.
No. Thanks for the question. It's a good question. I don't by no means mean to suggest that this is some kind of super evil genius super strategy. What I mean to say is that in this maddening reality, having no strategy can function as a strategy. This is a good example. To have conflicting goals for war can be wise, because at a certain moment when you decide that you want to end, you realize that you've destroyed the enemy as much as you can say, okay, now I advance the other goal and I free the hostages, and of course this comes. So having conflicting goals is a rational strategy, or can be one. What we are saying is this new deployment, the other way around. You signal to the world, to your own population, that this basic idea that you have to return at least your citizens is no longer something that has real power on you. And this allows you to continue the war indefinitely until absolute victory, which everybody knows is a complete abstraction. It in one sense, maybe Kantian in this sense, just because it's unattainable. So I hope that this answered. This clarifies
definitely.
something.
Sure. Thanks a lot. One following question. Do you think that also think that this also applies to Putin's war against Ukraine, the contradicting aims of the war?
I'm somewhat happily less knowledgeable about that one, so I'll leave it to the more knowledgeable.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay, I will skip the praise, so I will go directly to the question that bothers me from the beginning. You started the talk with the war is senseless, or how to end a war, and then you went on to describing a war as something negative, without identity, without its essence, something that is an excess that is impossible to control, and so on. That is always potential to, outburst. You said there is no, the war breaks out, and so on, has no, which all means that this is kind of rationality that cannot be contained in itself. It's always present. It always lurks. And then you went to quote Clausewitz, and Clausewitz in this respect is actually comforting author. He describes war as something rational. There are rational strategic, rational objectives, and so on, rational players. And if this is the case, then there is hope, meaning that if war has started rationally, it can end rationally as well. It can be controlled. It can be, let's say, envisaged. It's a strategy that can be won or lost. It's a chess game with, of course, people dying, but at the end, rational. And I'm afraid that portraying wars in this irrational manner actually diminishes the prospect of bringing peace. Perhaps that would be kind of realism when treating with wars. That would be, let's say, prompt to peace, closer to peace. What I'm afraid is that today there is no rational players any longer. And in that sense, I would go along with your descriptions of war as a vanishing mediator that used to be a vanishing mediator, but has become a self-perpetuating, self-conscious mediator that doesn't want to vanish. And why? Because there is nothing to mediate between. Because there is not those entities that previously, let's say in Clausewitz's perspective, acted, used war instrumentally. I think that the major problem today is that the state is disappearing, or there is a concept of society that has become ungovernable. We all see what happens, but the government, especially a German government, is a good example of that. Thus, as if, being on an automatic pilot, as if we're not able to prevent anything to happen, seeing what's going on, but unable to do anything. And this is why the war takes on.
Thank you very much. See how well I can respond briefly. I agree with you agreeing with me. And I disagree with you disagreeing with me. So this is in the following sense. I think the point that I take from Hegel, both in general and specifically here, is that weirdly it is an excess of quote-unquote rationality that brings out this irrationality of war. This is, I think, is the idea. The very idea that I mean, in broad terms in Hegel, the idea that, okay, there's contradiction, it's a logical problem, then there's the world, which is fine, and we can have this calculated self-interested rationality, doesn't work. The world contains irrational, real contradictions, and you have to handle them one way or another. The idea of purely rational mode of doing things is and therefore conducive to kind of repression and return of the repressed of that irrationality. This is, I mean, one way one could tackle is this, Hegel's insistence on monarchy, on this irrational element within the system of government, just, by genetics, by birth, signing off on things. You need that to maintain that. If you try to exercise irrationality too much, you get it tenfold back as an answer from the real. I think that's the line I think I take from Hegel, which is not to say, not at all, that there's nothing rational to do. Stop thinking. I think I very much try to think about it. And the bottom line is by no means, this is some atavistic thing that is always the same. I think it is changing in front of our eyes. And to understand that change is to understand the inner intimacy of our modes of thinking with something like war. That's, I mean, I don't know if this is enough of an answer, but I would say that the idea that we can just rationally make business as states or anything, gone, if we just believe in that too naively, then what we get is war. I think that is evident. I think that is an empirical description of reality, in some sense.
Ogden, but only if you're very quick.
Yeah, actually, my question builds up on Professor Kobe's one and refers back to Hegel. So you said state mediates between somewhat family and ossified civil society, but as we know, civil society is where he analyzes capitalism, which you refer to. And now it seems that this self-perpetuating mediator and expanding mediator is what wages war. So it's about civil society in terms of Hegel, so capitalism, and the state has been vanishing. So in that sense, that would actually add to your analysis if you expand that thing on the way capitalism, and in a way it shows why Hegel's theory of war doesn't quite work today.
Thank you for that. I think there are two components to that remark. I think one of them, of course, I didn't do it really. I mean, there is an sort of descriptive or analytic component to the question here, which is what precisely is the problem with somehow performing this mediation, and then the second question would be how can it work better? But I mean, one way of putting the disappearance of the state, it doesn't disappear at all. It just stops mediating. It starts thinking in those very certain terms of so-called civil society, and that's its way of failing to mediate. Okay.
Okay. Unfortunately, we used up our time, and I think we deserve a coffee, which is waiting back there, I guess. So maybe slightly longer pause, like 15 minutes, and then we have to try to stay as on the schedule as possible. Igor Cvejc is the next lecturer. Thank you again, Yuval.
Thank you.